1912, Villisca's Locked Windows. At the corner of 5th and Josiah in Villisca, Iowa, the Moore house sits like a photograph that no one will put back in the album. In the summer of 1912, the town was small enough to count its secrets, and this one began like so many American Sunday's church ice cream children in their best shoes. Josiah and Sarah Moore hosted a Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church. Their kids, Herman Catherine Boyd and Paul, recited verses in voices too serious for their age. Two friends, Lena and Ina Stillinger, accepted the Moores' welcome to sleep over. It was the kind of invitation that proves a town's innocence and destroys it. Sometime after midnight, a figure stepped across the threshold with the patience of someone who has learned to move in other people's houses. The chimney of the lamp was removed. Wicks were turned low. Every window shade was drawn to an identical height, each mirror covered with a piece of fabric, as if the visitor could not bear to see a reflection of what was about to happen. In the parents' room, Josiah and Sarah were first blows, so violent the ceiling bore axe marks from the upswing. The children next one room after another, quilts pulled carefully over faces, as if tenderness could excuse what the blade recorded. Downstairs, the Stillinger sisters. There is a detail old-timers lower their voices to tell a slab of bacon taken from the icebox and left beside the axe, as if the killer in the steaming hush of the kitchen remembered being hungry. When the neighbor noticed the house still quiet at dawn, she thought of a bad cold, a late night. By noon, relatives were rattling the door, the marshal was hunting for keys, and the town's gentle order buckled. Inside, the scene arranged itself into the kind of logic that haunts detectives, a method, not a frenzy. Bed covers straightened, clothing laid across chairs. The killer had not only killed, he had stayed. The investigation unfolded the way investigations did before modern forensics learned to punish carelessness. Neighbors tramped through the rooms. Souvenir seekers pocketed bits of a crime scene that would have been a textbook for future generations. Rumors multiplied because rumors do not require chain of custody. There was a drifter who confessed a farmer with a temper, a businessman whose rivalry with Josiah was an open wound, and finally a traveling minister, Reverend George Kelly, whose confessions came and went like bad weather. He was tried and acquitted. The case returned to silence. Villisca taught American towns what a house can hold without a sound. It also taught future investigators how not to conduct a major case. The scene was contaminated by half the population before photographers arrived. There were no fingerprint protocols, no preserved footprints, no consistent note-taking, no timeline stitched so tight it refused to be picked apart. Theories became reputations, and reputations became the kind of half-truths that turn neighbors into suspects forever. But the reason this case still draws breath over a century later isn't the gore. It's the geometry. 8 human beings in the span of a few rooms, a killer who behaves like a housekeeper after the fact, a town whose decency was used against it. The suggestion, terrifying because it feels practical, that the murderer was comfortable enough to linger. The axe itself, found at the scene, told the first lesson of the 20th century's cold cases. Sometimes the weapon answers the least important question. When people visit the Moore house now, they talk about presences, about photographs that won't sit straight, about the way the floorboards creak, even when no one is moving. But the true presence here is procedural. It's the ghost of the investigation that didn't happen, the fingerprints that were smudged by Sunday shoes, the window shade pulls that were never measured, the crude map of the killer's footsteps that should have been drawn and wasn't. If you want a prologue for a century of American cold cases, stand in the Villisca parlor and listen to the silence a town left behind while it tried to be helpful. In Villisca, the story refuses a villain you can name without argument. What you get instead is a pattern that will repeat in different clothes for the next 100 years, a place that thinks it is safe, a perpetrator who understands how safety sounds after midnight. an investigation that confuses motion for method, and a community that learns what it means to live beneath a question mark. This is how our timeline begins, not with a fingerprint matching a man to a weapon, but with a town learning that absence can be louder than any confession. 1918, 1919. The Axeman plays jazz. New Orleans has always been a city that prefers improvisation to doctrine, and in 1918, someone decided to write terror in that key. Doors were planned off with a chisel. Panels in kitchen doors were removed and set beside the jamb like borrowed parts. Couples woke to a figure already standing over them, an axe glinting a hat like a detail in a poster. Sometimes the victims were Italian grocers. Sometimes they were couples asleep in the heat. Sometimes the house itself looked chosen by mood and convenience. Police toyed with the notion of a vendetta, old country feuds exported on steamships, and then with the idea of a serial killer working to a pattern only he could hear. What made the Axeman of New Orleans more than a headlines creature was a letter printed in the newspaper allegedly from the murderer, declaring a night of safety for every home where jazz was played. The city responded like only New Orleans can. Phonographs cranked bands, booked parlors filled with horns and time. People danced with fear, the way they dance with grief in that town, face to face on tempo. The promised night passed without murder. Afterward, the killings resumed in a way that felt more like a storm than a plan. The Axeman years were a bridge between Villisca's dark bedrooms and the emerging idea of crime analysis. Detectives developed a taste for patterns, the entry method, the victims' businesses, the neighborhoods, the location of doors relative to alleys. They discussed the tool marks on splintered panels as if they were signatures. Plaster casts were made and then mislaid. Witness descriptions wavered like heat haze, tall, short, heavyset, lean, and the one solid thing felt like a performance staged for a city that could not resist theater. There were suspects. There always are. A man caught with bloody clothes that turned out to be his own chicken's blood. A barber with a temper and a timeline that almost fit. An ex-con with a record that played too loudly. There were theories that lifted the blame off a single perpetrator and spread it across the city's social fault lines. Anti-Italian prejudice gave credence to the vendetta idea. Xenophobia and class anxiety made it convenient to imagine them doing this to us. If you keep a case open long enough, it begins to repopulate itself with the prejudices of its era. Journalists did their part to inflate the legend. A murderer who writes letters about music is a headline writer's retirement plan. But strip away the cleverness and you get something that looks like the modern American cold case template, a campaign of crimes that feel related, a public image of the killer that hardens into folklore, and a file cabinet of clues that never assemble into the single photograph that gives a detective permission to rest. What keeps this case from sliding into sepia is its mood, how anxiety can be organized by culture into ritual. One citywide night of jazz became a form of civilian policing, an act of communal refusal to be afraid indoors. It did not solve anything. It did something stranger. It taught the city that even a killer can be compelled by rhythm, that fear can be negotiated for a few hours if an entire town agrees on a song. By 1919, the violence sputtered and hissed out the way urban crime waves often do when their engine is one man whose life changes or ends offstage. The Axeman joined the American cabinet of unsolved masks, and New Orleans went back to being the only place in America where a letter from a murderer can also be a programming note. For investigators, the lessons were practical entry points, tool mark comparison, community communication. For the rest of us, the lesson was American. If terror insists on a show, sometimes the safest place is the dance floor. 1930s Kingsbury Run and the Torso Shadow. Cleveland's East Side in the 1930s did not need another kind of hunger. The Depression had already turned Kingsbury Run, the ravine that cut through the city, into a geography of the dispossessed hovels, shanties, small fires, and coffee cans men whose biographies had been reduced to the contents of their pockets. Someone began hunting there. Bodies appeared without names and without heads, often without limbs. The press found a phrase that would do the suffering, the insult of rhythm, the torso murders. Medical legal science was learning to stand upright back then, and Cleveland's coroner became as significant as its police chiefs. Cause of death dismemberment technique, chemical traces on bone. This was the era when the morgue learned to talk like a lab. But the killer's work was methodical enough to defeat the vocabulary. Limbs cut at joints to complicate identification. Torsos dumped where the city's two economies met industry and poverty, as if the murderer were describing the town back to itself. Eliot Ness, the Prohibition era. Untouchable was Cleveland's safety director, and legend requires his entrance here. Ness raided shanty towns, burned them down in a gesture meant to deny the killer a hunting ground, and heard himself called a hero by people who had never slept cold under a bridge. In truth, the arson solved nothing and displaced many. The killer kept working indifferent to policy. The case file thickened with the new faith of the age scientific optimism, while the bodies declined to match up with missing persons reports. If you want to see a cold case manufacture itself in real time, watch a city try to investigate the murder of people. It never truly counted while they were alive. Suspects emerged. Letters arrived. A doctor never named here because the line between rumor and libel is easy to trip in print became a hobby horse for theorists who liked tidy stories that put a white coat over the blood. Another man confessed so many times that his confessions became their own kind of noise. Dismemberment suggests medical knowledge to people who have never gutted a fish, and the case built a mythology around surgical skill that may simply have been patience and a sharp blade. Kingsbury Run taught detectives hard arithmetic. If your victim pool includes the unhoused, the jobless, the disappeared, you begin every murder with two mysteries: who did it and who died. DNA would one day gift-wrap answers to that second question, but in the 1930s, identity often depended on a ring or a scar, a biography pinned to a single square inch of skin. The killer seemed to know this. He broke his victims into pieces that could not be named and left the city with a parade of torsos that were not just bodies, but messages: I choose who counts. What keeps the torso murders cold is not a lack of clues, but a surplus of them. There are enough patterns to draw a face and enough exceptions to erase it. The geography, the disposal, the routine, the deviations. You can build a profile that marches the case directly to your favorite suspect, like a dog to its owner. You can also build another profile that marches to a different door. When a case offers too many convincing lines, it quietly admits that it contains more than one story. By the end of the decade, Cleveland's attention wandered back to the business of surviving a depression and then a war. Ness's reputation remained marketable. The city's least fortunate remained uncounted. The case slid into the long drawer where the worst American questions sleep. If there's a morale here, it's not about Eliot Ness or some named villain. It's about morale math. Count people properly while they're alive, and the dead are harder to lose. Count them poorly, and a killer will show you how easy it is to make a person vanish twice. 1947, 1957. A star is killed, and a boy without a name. Los Angeles invented the trick of making death look cinematic, and in January 1947, it did it too well. A young woman's bisected body posed, washed, the mouth cut into a grim smile, was found in a vacant lot in the Leimert Park area. The papers called her the Black Dahlia, a nickname that said more about Hollywood than homicide. Elizabeth Short became the first victim of the post-war tabloid age to be devoured by her own coverage. Reporters interviewed friends and fabricators in equal measure, confected a life that fit the picture, and handed the LAPD 1,000 paper cuts masquerading as leads. The investigation suffered the standard mid-century ailments, overlapping jurisdictions, a press corps that mistook access for accuracy, and a suspect pool swollen by men whose vanity required them to confess to a murder they did not commit. Some were cleared quickly by alibis as sturdy as a studio contract. Others dissolved when the lab work returned nothing useful. The case's most persistent afterlife has been a marketplace of elegant suspects, doctors, moguls, artists, each theory choosing its villain not so much by evidence as by theme. The truth about Black Dahlia is dreary next to the legend the scene yielded less than the rumor promised. Across the country, and a decade later, Philadelphia discovered the opposite problem, a case without glamour so stark it felt like a dare. In 1957, a small boy's body was found in a cardboard box wrapped in a blanket, his hair crudely cut, his life reduced to a geometry of bruises and guesses. Police photographed him in the hope that someone would recognize a nose, an ear, a dimple. People came. People cried. No one knew him. He became America's unknown child, a phrase that sounds respectful until you realize how it flattens a person into a symbol. The boy in the box taught investigators how helpless a file can be without a name. Because if you can't identify a victim, you can't reverse engineer the life that led to the killing, the corner store, the school, the landlord, the pediatrician, the cousin who remembers a child going quiet all at once. Detectives chased specifics: a bassinet, a blanket pattern, a barber's cut. They chased families who sheltered children with too many falls downstairs. They investigated a woman whose story was so layered with trauma it broke the case open and then closed it again because trauma does not equal proof. What binds Black Dahlia and the boy in the box isn't their shape, it's their lesson. The Los Angeles case cautions us about the narcotic of narrative, the way a murder dressed for cinema will attract confessions, theories, and reputational lawsuits for decades, none of which moves the file closer to the shelf where solved cases sleep. The Philadelphia case warns us about humility, how little an investigator can do without the first anchor of identity. One case has too much story, the other has none. Both grew cold in the same wind. Decades later, the boy in the box would be given a name through forensic genetic genealogy, a modern grace that knitted a tiny human back into a family tree. Identification is not justice, but names matter. They allow investigators to knock on doors with purpose instead of hope. They allow a grave to say something other than unknown. In some ways, Elizabeth Short's case never suffered from lack of identity. It suffered from too much personality imposed from the outside in. The boy's case suffered from the opposite, a life stripped of context, until for a long time, the only story anyone could tell was about the box. Mid-century America learned two habits from these cases that we have yet to unlearn. The first is our appetite for a villain who flatters our cinematic preferences. The second is our neglect of children and the poor, which ensures that some murders begin with a disadvantage that has nothing to do with the killer's cleverness and everything to do with the victim's position in the social order. Between those two habits, cold cases thrive. Between those two habits, a country teaches itself what kinds of stories it prefers and what kinds of stories it is willing to let go missing. 1968, 1974. Zodiac and the Taxonomy of a Phantom. Northern California in the late 60s was a map of nouns. Americans still argue about freedom, fear, counterculture cops, and into that vocabulary walked a figure who preferred punctuation. The Zodiac did not just kill, he corresponded. He picked lovers' lanes and parking turnouts, stitched ballistics and blade into a portfolio, then mailed his resume to the region's newspapers. His letters were half confession, half script doctoring, and they taught the public a lesson that would echo for decades. A killer with a stamp and a flair for typography can crowd out every other voice in the room. The crimes begin like ordinary crimes, shots in the dark, A car that will not start a picnic interrupted and then becomes something instructional. A survivor at Lake Berryessa describes the costume, the insignia, the calm. The cab driver in San Francisco becomes a citywide panic because murder inside city limits is a different language than murder on the edge of a lake. The letters turn the press into both conduit and shield. Editors who would never print a kidnapper's instructions publish ciphers because puzzles, unlike ransom notes, feel like games. The killer threatens school buses. Police departments that share highways do not always share information, and the Bay Area's jurisdictional quilt gives the case a bureaucratic chill even before the evidence goes cold. The ciphers are the piece that turned a regional string of crimes into a national riddle. One is cracked quickly enough to sting, yielding a manifesto about hunting humans for sport signed with a crosshair. Another resists for half a century before private citizens untie it with modern tools and the patience of people who do math for fun. Decipherment. It turns out, produces a strange kind of disappointment. The content rarely equals the weight. The killer is clever in the way a man with too much time can be clever, not in the way a physicist is clever. What matters isn't profundity, it's control. With every envelope, he dictates the rhythm of the investigation, forcing detectives to answer his questions instead of asking their own. Suspects appear the way suspects always do in cases that graduate to folklore by personality first, by evidence second. A man with the right hobbies, a man with the right temper, a man with the right jawline in a composite drawn from adrenaline-sick memory. Over the decades, some names take on fan clubs strong enough to crowd out contrary facts because once a theory scratches the itch, a mystery leaves, it becomes hard to trade for a better one. Meanwhile, laboratories learn to talk to atoms with finer and finer questions. Partial DNA profiles from stamps and envelopes touch DNA from places no detective in the 70s would have bothered to swab. Fragments are gathered. Nothing closes in the legal sense. The Zodiac sits in that category. America knows too well solved sort of at dinner tables and on message boards, and unsolved where it matters on paper. What the case gave modern policing was a taxonomy, how to triage a media active offender, how to treat letters as crime scenes, how to bind agencies together before a killer learns to surf their seams, how to let the public help without letting the public steer. It also seeded a cultural reflex we still haven't cured. We equate cryptic with brilliant taunting with unstoppable. We mistake a knack for performance for a guarantee of permanence. The hard truth is simpler and less cinematic. The Zodiac was dangerous and organized and lucky. He learned from each crime and from each headline about his crimes, and he exploited a region whose police departments had not yet been trained by a steady diet of serial offenders. In the end, the Zodiac file is heavy with the right nouns and light on the right verbs. Bullets, fibers, ciphers, interviews, suspects, composites, yes. Indictments, no. For a storyteller, the case offers an embarrassment of atmosphere. For a detective, it offers a study in restraint. Do not confuse correspondence with confession. Do not treat a puzzle as a passport. And do not ever hope that a man who invented himself on paper will also be kind enough to end himself there. 1975. Jimmy Hoffa leaves the table. Suburban Detroit, July 30, 1975. A heat that makes neckties feel like obligations. The Machus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township sits tidy behind a hedge that never meant to be historical. At 2:15 p.m., James Riddle Hoffa, ex-Teamsters boss, strike whisperer, ex-con, turned comeback artist, steps out of his green Pontiac and checks his watch, the way men do when time has always answered to them. He's here for a sit-down he cannot afford to miss and cannot afford to make. The names on his calendar glow like warning lights. He has spent a lifetime turning pressure into leverage. Today, pressure will turn into absence. Inside the restaurant, a hostess arranges silverware, whose reflections will one day be examined like evidence. Outside, Hoffa waits irritation blooming into suspicion. Two men he expected, one with a reputation in labor, one with a reputation in organized crime, do not arrive. He calls home from a payphone, leaves a message that sounds casual if you don't know how to hear it. At 2:45, according to some accounts, a maroon Mercury pulls into the lot. There are versions of this scene that include a friendly face in the back seat, a hand raised in half a wave, a decision made in the calculus of old loyalties and new risks. What we know is smaller. Hoffa's car remains where he left it. His appointment remains theoretical. The afternoon closes. Itty fist. By early evening, worry stops being a private emotion and becomes a procedural. Family calls police. Federal agents who have learned to spell Teamsters like a weather system begin to circle. The parking lot becomes a map where every cigarette butt is an adverb. Witnesses remember what witnesses always remember: a shape, a color, a time that felt like about. The night makes the case official. Hoffa is missing in a way that men like Hoffa are not supposed to be missing. It is one thing to fall from power. It is another to vanish like a rumor. What the investigation inherits is not just a timeline, but a network, dozens of men whose phones live in other men's pockets, whose names appear in other names' address books. Federal agents build concentric circles the scheduled meeting. The men who could have stopped it. The men who would have benefited. They lean on informants. They wiretap telephones that hiss with the sound of old alliances pretending to be new. They search cars, lakes, a horse farm, a dump site, the places where fiction likes to hide bodies and non-fiction prefers to find them. Dogs alert. Excavators dig. Journalists stake the perimeters and build careers on sentences that begin with "sources say." There are theories enough to populate a small town. A killing arranged by men who saw Hoffa's attempt to regain Union power as a threat to carefully balanced portfolios of influence. A meeting that did occur in a different car, resulting in a fatal argument that had more to do with the future than the past. Transport of a body that never touched the places the cameras loved. Destruction so total that forensics would always be chasing a phantom. There are names that live too comfortably in sentences without indictments, and families who learn how many ways English can form a question out of the words, "Are you sure?" What the Hoffa case gave American policing was not closure. It was infrastructure. Task forces learned to stitch together labor records, wire records, travel vouchers, diner receipts, the small chaff of a big man's movements. Prosecutors learned the difference between what a newsroom can print and what an indictment can carry. The FBI ran down leads the way a surgeon removes lymph nodes methodically one by one because spread is the fear. There were informant stories that later looked like alibis disguised as help. There were excavations that turned acres of dirt into archives of false promises. Hoffa's biography keeps the mystery hot. The son of a coal miner who taught himself to turn a paycheck into policy, a Union president who made enemies the way storms make puddles, a prisoner whose post-parole ambition sounded to some like a return of weather they had learned to prefer at a distance. He is one of the few missing persons whose absence remains a national pastime asked about at dinner tables during football games beneath the hum of an air conditioner in a house where no one has ever been followed. His face looks out from bookshelves like an anchor and a dare. What can be said without defaming the living is limited and simple. No person has been convicted for Hoffa's disappearance. Multiple publicized searches have failed to recover remains. Law enforcement maintains files that thickened for decades and then settled into a rhythm of periodic review as new claims arrive and old claims learn to dress in new clothes. The case is a monument to the power of logistics. If you control the who, where, and when of a meeting in a world where loyalty is a currency, you can make a man the same way you unmake him quietly with a car door in daylight. For a storyteller, the last image is always the same. A heavy man in a short-sleeved shirt squinting into July, checking a watch he believes is on his side. For an investigator, the last image is the parking lot without him, the ticks of a clock that belongs to a different jurisdiction now, and the knowledge that some disappearances are not solved by finding bodies, but by finding the moment someone decided that power would travel better without a passenger. 1976-1994. The Circleville Letters, written in red. In 1976, the male in Circleville, Ohio, learned to speak in a different voice. Block letters, like they'd been cut with a ruler. Red underlines that felt like accusations turned into punctuation. Envelopes to school board officials, bus drivers, spouses, politicians. The writer knew too much affairs, rumors, secrets that belonged to kitchens and pillow talk, and decided to make the whole town a confidant. Circleville did what towns do when the private becomes public. It divided itself into readers and suspects. At the center of the early storm stood Mary Gillespie, a school bus driver accused anonymously of an affair. Signs appeared along her route. She tore them down. Letters arrived at her home. She hid them, then showed them, then learned that secrecy is a kind of oxygen for a fire you do not want. The town measured each other's pens and tempers. Meanwhile, the writer broadened the canvas allegations about officials, about teachers, about the kind of ordinary sins that when written in capital letters begin to look like crimes. In 1977, tragedy sharpened the narrative. Mary's husband Ron received a call that, according to reports, sent him out of the house with a handgun and a direction. Minutes later, he was dead, his truck wrapped around a tree, his blood alcohol level controversial then and now. Some saw an accident, some saw an ambush, some saw a staging so clumsy it looped back into sinister. The letter writer treated the death like a new page, folding it into the theme. Circleville's secrets were not simply embarrassing, they were dangerous. Years passed, and the letters did not learn to behave. In 1983, Mary found a sign about her daughter rigged with a booby trap, a pistol attached to a box to fire when pulled up. The gun's serial number linked to Paul Freshour, Mary's former brother-in-law. Investigators found circumstantial threads, a workplace alibi with gaps, handwriting analyses that are best described as suggestive, not definitive. Freshour was convicted not of writing letters, but of the booby trap felonious assault, and sent to prison. Circleville exhaled the breath it had been holding for 7 years. And then the letters kept coming. They arrived while Freshour was incarcerated, sent to him to officials, to television shows that had lifted the case into the National Curiosity Cabinet. Prison officials investigated whether he had help, whether return addresses lied, whether the U.S. mail was being framed as much as the man. A much-discussed letter arrived for a TV producer after a segment aired. Another targeted local officials with fresh allegations. Freshour maintained innocence until his death. The writer, whoever the writer was, refused to retire. The case file is a study in how a crime without a body can still leave wounds. There are forensic fragments, postage marks, stationery, fiber, partial prints, the aerogram grammar of a particular era's envelopes. There are social fragments, marriages under stress offices, with closed doors, neighbors who began each conversation with a silent calculation: had this person read a letter about me, or written one law enforcement, faced a problem with no standard operating procedure guide. How do you investigate a voice that knows your schedule, your kids' names, your weak spots? The Circleville letters taught investigators about the ecology of rumor. A town is a network, and the writer used that network like wire. The letters were both content and carrier accusations and the act of accusing. If you arrested the content, the carrier remained. If you arrested the carrier, the content could be replicated by anyone with a typewriter and a motive. The booby trap is what gave the case its only courtroom weight, and even that weight sits years later under a cloud of doubt in the court of public opinion. There are moments in this story that feel cinematic because they are the roadside sign that doubles as a weapon, the mailbox that becomes an accomplice, the cut-and-paste aesthetic that made the writer's block letters into a brand, but the texture of the harm is quieter. Circleville learned to self-censor. People avoided topics, lunches, eye contact. A child in the back of a bus knew adults were telling a story he was not supposed to hear. A TV show introduced the town to itself as a plot line. The writer kept writing. No one has been convicted of composing the Circleville letters. Experts disagree about authorship the way sommeliers disagree about hints of berries. What we have instead of a conclusion is a set of lessons. Secrets are a resource. Mail is a weapon that doesn't need a trigger. And a community can be held hostage by a tone as effectively as by a gun. In the end, the Circleville letters are not simply about who wrote them. They're about what happens when a town begins to believe that anyone might have. 1995. The morning Jodi vanished. Before dawn on June 27, 1995, Mason City, Iowa, wore the blue of a TV test pattern. In an apartment complex a few minutes from the newsroom, Jodi Huisentruit, 27 anchor of KIMT's morning broadcast, snoozed a series of alarms in a life choreographed to the second. She was the kind of local celebrity who makes small cities feel seen, upbeat, professional, the smile that reads birthday cupcakes at a school and homicide scripts at 6 a.m. A producer called around 4 a.m. "You're late," Jodi answered. Cheerful, said she'd be right there. She threw on clothes, grabbed her bag, and stepped into the parking lot. What happened next is why her name is still spoken in a tense, present tense. Her Mazda Miata sat half-loaded. The key was bent, found near the driver's door. A high heel lay several feet away, a blow dryer on the ground, papers scattered like they'd tried to follow her. Neighbors reported hearing a scream in the dark, the kind of sound that delays interpretation until the brain catches up and it's too late to be useful. A white van, maybe white, maybe not, appeared in more than one, retelling a silhouette in a sodium vapor memory. Police arrived fast, because television people disappear. Loudly, stations call managers panic clocks. Notice. The scene was processed with a care that future critics would call both diligent and inevitably inadequate, because no scene is perfect when what you need is hindsight. Plaster casts, photographs, interviews with neighbors over coffee and a sleepless stare. The station ran a newscast without its morning anchor, and then began covering the loss of its morning anchor, the kind of feedback loop that can help a case and also complicate it. Viewers became witnesses. Witnesses became theorists. Theorists became the kind of people detectives learn to call back last. Suspects and persons of interest arrived the way they always do when a young woman vanishes near home, concentric circles outward from familiarity to coincidence. Men who wanted to be closer than they were. Men who had been closer and left with an argument unsorted. Men whose work placed them near her commute. Men whose alibis were furnished after repeated requests. There were no arrests that history has endorsed. There were searches of riverbeds, of gravel pits, of places a body might be if the worst version of the story were the true one. There were tips that stung because they sounded plausible until you asked them to walk. What makes Jodi's case persist is not only the media angle and anchorwoman gone before air, but the scene's choreography. The bent key suggests interruption. The scattered items suggest momentum interrupted at the edge of a car door. The scream suggests a timeline measured in seconds. If you're a detective, this is where you wish the universe used more friction, one more second, one more porch light, one more neighbor opening blinds. Instead, you get asphalt dew and a clock that did not raise its voice until after. Jodi's life offered two narratives that the public cannot resist: the American striving, a woman on the rise in a business that feeds on charisma and discipline, and the stalker-adjacent risk because success within reach is visible and visibility paints a target. Friends describe a person who is alert to attention without being paranoid, who documented incidents that felt intrusive, who weighed restraining orders against the oxygen attention can provide to a man who craves it. The case file contains pages that look like all the others until your eye catches a pattern. A call here, a car there, a feeling that congeals into a precaution. Too late. Over the years, the investigation has been reopened, re-audited, handed to new eyes with new tools. Data that slept in manila folders now speaks in databases that connect plates to names and names to addresses faster than anyone could in 1995. The remains of vehicles have been searched when tips justified the fuel. Journalists have kept the case warm, not the feverish warmth of exploitation, but the steady warmth of weather that keeps permafrost from forming. Podcasts, documentaries, billboards. A scholarship in Jodi's name. A town that refuses to let the fuse burn down to nothing without checking again for sparks. No one has been charged with abducting Jodi Heisentrut. The evidence is suggestive, but insufficient in the only room that matters. That is the terrible arithmetic of so many 90s cases, too early for ubiquitous cameras, too late for the kind of neighborhood invisibility that once let a predator make noise without worry. Jodi's morning holds in it the thin edge of a minute, the distance from door to driver's seat, the distance from a call saying, "You're late," to a call saying she's missing. Some cases are about monsters. This one is about timing. For most of us, the last image is of a sunrise over a small city, a newsroom waking to the red light of a camera and the blue light of a squad car and an anchor's chair that stays empty a little longer than anyone can explain. For those who work the file, the last image is simpler, a bent key on warm asphalt, a question mark where a name should be, and the knowledge that a case is only truly cold when the last living person who remembers a detail stops picking up the phone. 2001-2025. Bonefields Beach, highways and how cold cases, warm. In 2009, outside Albuquerque, a woman walking her dog on the West Mesa found a bone, and then another. The desert west of a city is where secrets go to dry out, and soon the secret had a number, the remains of 11 women and a fetus most linked to vulnerable lives, sex work addiction, homelessness that make families harder to find, and timelines harder to draw. The press called the unknown perpetrator the West Mesa bone collector, because the American press can give a sobriquet to grief faster than it can fund a social worker. Detectives built victimologies, mapped disappearances against construction booms and busts, walked grids in dust that erases yesterday by lunchtime. They developed suspects, chased leads into dead ends, and learned again the lesson Cleveland taught: if you do not count people properly when they are alive, you will lose them twice. Across the country on Long Island, human remains began turning up along a barrier island highway, a stretch of sand and scrub that luxury real estate pretends is only for postcards. The phrase Gilgo Beach became a shorthand for a whodunit, with coastal wealth in the background and escort ads in the foreground. For years, the case rested in the uneasy category of known-unknown multiple victims, likely more than one set of hands, jurisdictional bruises, and the sickening suspicion that law enforcement itself had failed the victims long before they died. In 2023, an arrest in connection with several of the Gilgo Four reframed the conversation without ending it. Courts move slowly, and a murder's truth has to meet a higher standard than a true crime podcast's climax. Other victims along that coast remain under investigation, their stories older than any headline. Between West Mesa and Gilgo sits a term that changed everything: forensic genetic genealogy. In 2018, a former police officer was arrested in California for the Golden State Killer spree because investigators followed a family tree up from distant relatives who had submitted DNA to consumer sites. The method was both simple and revolutionary: use publicly available genetic matches to build mirror trees, then collapse them with geography, age, sex, and opportunity until one name remains. The approach has since identified victims who died nameless and suspects who thought the past had cured itself of memory. It is not a magic wand. It raises privacy questions a democracy should argue about. But it is the single warmest wind to blow across cold case country in half a century. What warms a case, finally, is not just technology, it is stewardship. Detectives who refuse to let boxes rot, families who keep flyers, journals, and phone records like sacred texts, prosecutors willing to say we were wrong when science tells them so, agencies that learn to share rather than hoard because offenders don't respect city limits, media that learn to cover without colonizing grief, communities that count the vulnerable so carefully that future investigators inherit names instead of numbers. West Mesa's victims deserve that. So do the women of Gilgo, the boys of Kingsbury, run the couples on the Parkway, the kids in Springfield, the beauties of Hollywood, who were not born to be symbols. The years since 2001 have also taught us a grim grace about pattern. Killers who hunt the marginalized will often be caught only when the city decides the marginalized matter in budget meetings. Serial offenders who learn to read headlines and lie to databases can be tripped by a cousin's curiosity about Irish roots. A 23andMe kit can become a subpoena, and a family reunion can become a crossroads. That is not fate or karma, it is infrastructure. It is what happens when science, policy, and persistence decide to sit at the same table. By 2025, the phrase cold case no longer means what it meant in 1912 or 1930 or even 1996. It does not mean hopeless. It means pending. Pending a sibling's swab, a technician's training, a detective's second look, a journalist's restraint, a public's willingness to fund the unglamorous work of method. The American century of unsolved has been, in another register, a century of learning to ask better questions and to keep asking them after the cameras leave. Some files will never close, but more will than we once believed. And that might be the only honest epilogue a storyteller can offer. The last scene hasn't been written yet, because the lab lights are still on.